The room was silent, thick with anticipation, a fragile truce between skepticism and a desperate unspoken hope. Then, under the flickering gaze of a single candle, the board began to move. A slow, deliberate scrape of wood on wood that cut through the stillness like a whisper in a tomb. No one was touching it. At least, no one claimed to be. The participants' hands floated a breath away, their knuckles white, their faces a mixture of terror and fascination. No one was speaking. And yet, letter by letter, with a certainty that defied explanation, it formed an answer. The planchette, a three-legged messenger, seemed to have a will of its own. It started like a game, the kind of thing people do when they want to be scared for fun. A rite of passage fueled by bravado and late-night curiosity. For over a century, this has been its primary identity. A novelty, a parlour trick sold in a box. It was born from the spiritualist movement of the 19th century, a time when society was desperate to pierce the veil and speak with the dead. The talking board was patented not as a tool of divination, but as a harmless amusement. But a tool, once created, can be used for purposes its makers never intended. But in haunted places, in rooms saturated with history and sorrow, the line between a game and an invitation can disappear very quickly. The board ceases to be a toy. It becomes a focal point, a key turning a lock that was never meant to be opened. Is it merely the idea-motor effect, the subconscious involuntary movements of the users spelling out what they secretly want or fear to hear? Or is it something else? A conscious act of reaching out into the silence and finding the silence is not empty at all. Across abandoned homes, shuttered hotels, empty schools and forgotten institutions, Ouija board stories follow the same unnerving pattern. The details change, the names are different, but the core narrative remains stubbornly consistent. These are not just tales of bumps in the night. They are chronicles of communication, of dialogues that escalate with terrifying speed. Someone asks a question, a simple, often innocent query, whispered into the dark. Is anyone there? Something answers. A name, a date, a warning. And then the haunting begins to behave like it was waiting. The activity, once random or dormant, becomes intelligent, responsive. It's as if the board didn't summon a presence, but simply gave a voice to one that had been there all along, listening. Tonight, we're tracing 10 locations where people claimed the dead answered back. We will examine the accounts, look at the historical records, and explore the local lore that grew around these events like ivy over a gravestone. These are places where a simple board game allegedly became a conduit for tragedy, obsession, and fear. We will present the stories as they were told by those who experienced them and investigate the history of the locations themselves, searching for clues in the past that might explain the terrifying events of the present. Some of these stories began with grief, a desperate attempt to contact a lost loved one, to hear their voice one last time. Some began with curiosity, an academic or journalistic interest in the paranormal that became deeply personal. And some, as they so often do, began with a dare, a challenge to the darkness that was unexpectedly answered. But every one of them left behind the same question, a question that echoes long after the board is put away. What exactly moved that board? Was it the hidden grief of a mourning heart? The collective anxiety of a group of frightened teenagers? Or was it an external intelligence, an entity with its own agenda, using the hopes and fears of the living as a key to its own prison? The answer, it seems, is never simple. The first story begins in a house where the questions became more specific than anyone expected. a place with a long memory, where the land itself seemed to hold a grudge. Here, a group of friends, seeking a thrill, would find themselves in a conversation with the past, a conversation that would reveal a secret the town had tried to bury for decades. They asked who was there, and the board gave them a name. The Ashbury house stood at the edge of a quiet road, abandoned long enough to become a dare. 5 teenagers broke in on a summer night looking for adrenaline, not ghosts. In the upstairs bedroom, they found a dusty Ouija board tucked inside a dresser drawer. One of them joked that the house had been saving it for them. They asked the first question that came to mind: "Is anyone here?" The answer came back slowly: "Yes." At first, they thought someone in the house was messing with them. Then the board spelled a name none of them recognized. When they checked old property records later, that name belonged to a child who had died there decades earlier. That was the first sign the house was not done speaking. The second came that same night, when footsteps started moving above them in a room no one had entered. They froze, listening to the rhythm cross the floor from one side of the room to the other. Then the sound stopped directly over their heads. One of the girls whispered that she felt something watching her from behind the wall. When they ran, the upstairs window was open, even though no one remembered opening it. They left the board behind. The next day, the board was gone. No one admitted taking it. And for weeks afterward, the house remained a topic of rumour because people walking past it said they could hear a child laughing inside. The Blackwell Hotel once welcomed travellers with its gilded promises of luxury and comfort. But after it closed its doors for the last time, its grand hallways became the kind of place where whispers travelled farther than footsteps, and every shadow seemed to hold its breath. During a recent, ambitious renovation project aimed at restoring the hotel to its former glory, workers discovered a heavy, locked trunk in a forgotten storage room near the basement, buried under decades of dust and discarded furniture. Inside, wrapped in a stained and yellowing tablecloth, was a simple, worn Ouija board. It was an object that seemed to hum with a latent energy, a silent invitation from the past. But the history of the Blackwell was far more complex than a simple child's game. Built in 1928 by industrialist Marcus Blackwell, the hotel was a monument to Jazz-age opulence. For 2 decades, it was the jewel of the city, but its fortunes began to turn after the war. Records show a series of misfortunes: a small fire in the West Wing in 1949, a string of bankruptcies, and a slow, agonizing decline into disrepair. By the 1970s, it was a shadow of its former self, a place for transients and secrets. Local law, however, focuses on one event above all others. In the winter of 1957, a long-term resident named Eleanor Vance, a quiet woman who occupied a room on the 7th floor, vanished. A local newspaper at the time reported that she simply ceased to be, leaving behind all her worldly possessions as if she intended to return in a moment. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, no witnesses. She was there, and then she was not. The hotel officially closed in 1982, its corridors falling silent, left to decay and memory. The renovation was meant to erase that dark history, but some things refused to be paved over. Unaware of the specific tragedy tied to the hotel's past, the night crew, bored and surrounded by the building's oppressive silence, decided to test their discovery. It was half as a joke to break the monotony, and half because the building already felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. They gathered in the cavernous, empty ballroom, the planchette cold beneath their fingertips. After a few nervous questions about their own futures, one worker, emboldened by the silence, asked the question that hung in the air of every abandoned place. "Is anyone here with us? Did anyone die in this hotel?" The planchette, which had been still, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it slid across the board, spelling out a single, chilling word. Yes. A wave of unease washed over the group, but they pressed on. "Where?" another asked, his voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out a room number, 713. The next day, morbid curiosity got the better of the site foreman. He dug through the boxes of old records salvaged from the manager's office. When he checked the guest ledgers from the 1950s, he found it. Room 713 had been registered to one Eleanor Vance, the same woman who had vanished without a trace in 1957. After that night, the atmosphere in the hotel shifted from unsettling to actively hostile. The crew started hearing the distinct sound of a woman crying, always seeming to come from just behind a closed door, but the room would be empty when they opened it. Tools would go missing only to reappear in strange places. Cold spots would drift through the hallways on otherwise warm nights. The final straw for one worker came when he was alone, waiting for the service elevator. He swore it descended on its own, the doors opening with a soft ding, the floor indicator lit for the 7th floor. The floor the board had named. The hallway beyond was empty, silent, and waiting. The hotel manager blamed nerves until the cameras caught a shape crossing the lobby at 2:13 in the morning. No one on the footage appeared to notice it. The board was locked in a closet after that. The next morning, the closet door was open. The board was sitting in the middle of the lobby. By then, the workers were no longer joking. One of them quit before the week was over. He later said the worst part was not the crying or the footsteps or the moving board. It was the feeling that something had been watching them from the lobby long before they ever opened the trunk. And that is when the story moved from strange to unmistakably haunted. The Briarwood Asylum was already infamous before anyone brought a board inside. It had a reputation for lost voices, slammed doors, and rooms that felt occupied when they were empty. A paranormal team entered with cameras and one Ouija board, intending to treat it like an experiment. They placed the board in a former isolation room. The first question was simple. Who is here with us? The answer came back in a way that made everyone stop breathing. Find me. No one moved for several seconds. Then the audio recorder caught a second voice, one no one heard live. It said the name of a patient who had died there years before. The investigators split up to search the building. That was the mistake. In the East Wing, one camera shut off without warning. In the West Wing, a door slammed shut on its own. Back in the isolation room, the board had shifted several inches from where they left it. No one claimed to have touched it. One of them later said the room felt colder after the board answered. Another swore she heard knocking from inside the wall beside her shoulder. They left before sunrise. The footage from that night became the reason the team never returned. The Marrow house looked ordinary from the outside, which made the story feel even less believable. A family moved in after it had stood empty for years, bringing boxes, furniture, and the assumption that silence meant safety. In the attic, the father found an old Ouija board behind a stack of trunks. His teenage daughter wanted to try it that same night. The board first spelled out a name that belonged to no one in the family. Then it gave a date. When they searched the house history, That date matched the death of the woman who had lived there before. After that, the daughter began waking to the sound of someone pacing above her bedroom. No one else heard it. But every night, the pacing returned at exactly 2:07. The Red Hollow School was closed so long that its classrooms looked less abandoned than preserved, a silent monument to a community's past. But before it became a whisper in the dark, it was the heart of the town. Constructed in 1922, the school was a source of local pride, its red brick facade a symbol of progress. For decades, its halls echoed with the sounds of learning and laughter. But the school's history is marked by a series of unfortunate events, culminating in the tragedy that would forever define its legacy. The central figure in its lore is Eleanor Vance, a music teacher who joined the faculty in 1947. Colleagues described her as dedicated, if not a bit severe, a woman who believed discipline and art were intertwined. She was particularly protective of the school's music room and its prized grand piano. On the night of October 28, 1958, a fire broke out in the school's boiler room. The official report cited faulty wiring. The blaze spread quickly, engulfing the West Wing. Eleanor Vance had reportedly stayed late to prepare for an upcoming recital. Firefighters found her in the music room, having succumbed not to the flames, but to smoke inhalation. She was found near the piano, as if trying to protect it. The school reopened a year later, but it was never the same. A passage from the town clerk's private journal, dated 1961, reads, "The children speak of cold spots in the music room. Janitors refuse to clean it after dark, claiming the piano plays a single discordant note on its own." Over the years, as enrollment declined, the stories grew. Tales of a woman's stern voice echoing in empty corridors, of sheet music rustling in a sealed room, and of a shadowy figure seen in the windows. The school was finally shuttered in 1985, its history left to decay and its legends to fester. It became a rite of passage for local youths, a test of courage. Students once dared each other to enter after dark, armed with flashlights and enough fear to make every shadow feel alive. They were searching for a thrill, unaware they were about to become the next chapter in the school's haunted history. In the music room, a place already heavy with sorrow, they found a Ouija board tucked inside the very piano bench Eleanor Vance had died trying to save. It was old, the letters faded, but it felt strangely active, almost warm to the touch. Gathering around it, surrounded by the ghosts of old recitals, they placed their fingers on the planchette. With nervous energy filling the silence, they asked the board who was there. The planchette moved, slowly at first, then with unnerving confidence. It spelled out a name, Eleanor. The board answered with the name of the former teacher, the teacher who had died in that very building after the fire years earlier. A sudden chill dropped the temperature in the room. From that night on, the school became known for a new phenomenon, a disembodied voice heard in empty classrooms. It would call the names of the living down the hall, a clear, commanding whisper that would stop the moment anyone turned around, leaving only a profound and terrifying silence. The dare had become a curse. The experience left a permanent mark on those who were there. Several of the students claimed the board followed them home, not physically, but in their dreams. They reported nightmares of being back in the music room, forced to play the piano for an unseen critical audience, their fingers fumbling over the keys. And in one particularly disturbing report, one of the students who had taken the board home swore that after packing it away in a sealed box, They could hear the planchette moving on its own, faintly scraping against the wood, as if trying to spell out one last, unheard message from the darkness. The Bell Tower estate was a mansion built for wealth, but it became famous for the things people heard after the last light went out. Guests staying there for a private event brought a Ouija board as a novelty. Late that night, after the music stopped, they used it in the upstairs library. The board identified itself as someone who had died in the house. Then it gave a warning: leave before midnight. When they ignored it, the power failed. The only light came from phones and a single candle. That was when the upstairs door opened by itself. No one entered, but everyone heard footsteps crossing the hall. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The board never just answered questions, it established presence, then it built fear. And once the fear settled in, the hauntings seemed to intensify on their own. That is why so many of these stories survive, not because everyone agreed on what happened, but because too many people described the same impossible details. A name, a warning, a presence that seemed to arrive the moment the questions began, and a house, hotel, school, or asylum that never felt empty again. Maybe that is the real danger of the board. Not that it lies, but that it answers. If these stories prove anything, it is that some places remember more than people realize, and sometimes the memory of a place is waiting for someone to ask the wrong question. The locations may change, but the pattern stays the same. Curiosity opens the door. Fear keeps it open. If you want more cinematic paranormal documentaries like this, like the video, comment which location unsettled you most, and subscribe for the next story.